So what is the optimal intake of carbohydrates? Well, it depends. So most people actually think that because the body can make its own glucose, that there's no need to consume, exogenous carbohydrate. But actually, there's some good evidence for why we want to consume some carbohydrates. I would say even in people who are carb intolerant, they probably should be getting at least 40 grams of carbohydrates. And the reason is because in order to actually make our own glucose, it's called gluconeogenesis, we can form a very little bit of our own glucose from dietary fat and from burning our own fat. So in states of prolonged fasting, you might be able to get about 20% of the glucose that your body needs, because your brain has to run on about 130 grams of glucose per day. So your body has to make it. Red blood cells have to run on glucose. Your eyes have to run on glucose. So a lot of people kind of argue, well, burning ketones is a cleaner fuel and it's a more optimal fuel. Well, why does the body then require and run on certain organs glucose? If ketosis was truly the optimal fuel, then why does the body prefer to run on glucose for the brain, for the red blood cells, etc., for your eyes? There's reasons for that, and I'll go over those in a second. But back to the point or the argument people will try to make, oh, well, you can simply just make your own glucose. Well, that is stressful on the body. There is things that happen. Cortisol goes up, adrenaline goes up for you even to be able to do this. And some people will argue and say, well, actually prolonged ketosis, cortisol and adrenaline eventually go down. Well, that could be a bad thing, actually. In fact, if you look at anecdotally, even in myself, after 1 or 2 years of low carb, I experienced problems, and now I'm no longer quote unquote low carb, moderate carb intake. But basically, exercise performance went down, energy levels went down, fatigue went up, muscle cramps, muscle spasms can increase. We see these anecdotes, consistently. And so what it's telling me is even though cortisol and adrenaline may normalize, you may have burned out the adrenal glands. So in actual animal studies, and this is similar too with low salt intakes, you can live on a low salt intake, but it's stressful. Your adrenal glands are overproducing aldosterone. Just like not getting enough carbs, your adrenal glands will overproduce cortisol and adrenaline. So what happens in animal studies when that occurs? The adrenal glands hypertrophy. They increase in size, which is the prerequisite to any organ burning out. So, heart failure, the heart enlarges. So when you see organs enlarging, that's not a good thing. So cortisol and adrenaline normalizing may just simply be due to adrenal burnout. Or your body may be increasing the receptors for those hormones or the downstream effects because it doesn't want to pump out so many hormones. So normalization of hormones on a ketogenic diet doesn't necessarily mean that that's our normal state, nor that actually those hormones have truly normalized. So let's keep that in mind. But as I said, the brain needs about 130 grams of glucose. We don't actually know, I don't think we have good numbers, I haven't ran across them, on how much the red blood cells need, how much the eyes need, and the central nervous system prefers glucose. But let's just say 130 grams. Let's also assume that from fat burning of prolonged fasting, okay, so this is going to be more fat burning than just being in ketosis. You're eating nothing, so fat burning is going to be much more higher. In prolonged fasting, you may be able to get 20% of glucose from your own fat burning. Okay, so that's what? So 130 grams required for the brain, not counting red blood cells and not counting your eyes. That's 26 grams of glucose you may be able to get from your own fat burning during ketosis, which you wouldn't, because prolonged fasting fat burning is not the same as ketosis. But let's just assume you can get 26 grams of glucose formed from your own fat burning. Now, eating 160 grams of fat will only give you about 7.5 to 8 grams of glucose. That's it. Because triglyceride being converted into glucose is only 5%. That's the conversion rate, 5%, because triglyceride is 10% glycerol and it takes 2 glycerols to form 1 glucose. Okay, so even if you ate 160 grams of fat, your body's only going to be able to turn that into maybe 8 grams of glucose. Okay, then protein. You have to take the protein that you're eating, instead of the protein that would be going towards protein synthesis and muscle building and into your protein pools and into protein recycling, you now have to utilize a lot of your dietary protein to actually form glucose via gluconeogenesis. And it's not super efficient, about 50% efficiency for that. So when you calculate it all out, you actually end up needing about 75 grams of protein that would typically go towards building muscle or other functions of the body, making hormones, etc., that now have to go into forming that 38 grams of glucose that you absolutely are going to have to use your own dietary fat, your own fat burning, and your dietary protein to form, okay? So remember, 75 grams of protein that you're eating, half of that will be converted into glucose. So, you're talking like 37 grams or so of glucose. So when you add all that up, and then also up to 45% of the glucose needs of the brain can be met through ketosis as well. So that's why when you add all these things up, best case scenario is that you are going to be taking, if you're eating no carbohydrate, right? You're on a zero carb, let's say carnivore diet or ketogenic diet, etc. And you have to be in ketosis too, remember, because we said that ketosis will decrease the glucose needs for the brain by about 45%. It all comes down to that you need about 75 grams of protein to get that, let's say 38 grams of glucose that you absolutely have to have, that ketosis won't cover, that eating fat won't cover, and that burning your own fat won't cover. It comes down to you have to consume 75 grams of protein to form the glucose that is absolutely required for just the brain. We're not even talking about red blood cells and eyes to function. So basically carbs are protein sparing is what I'm trying to say. I know that's a lot of math and it's complicated, but sometimes we need to really understand, well, how much basically protein am I actually getting wiped out right away from my intake that has to go to forming that glucose. So that's one disadvantage of always being in ketosis, is that 75 grams of your protein is going to have to go into gluconeogenesis to form glucose for the brain, the red blood cells, the eyes, etc. So you're already starting at a 75 gram protein deficit if you're not consuming any carbohydrate. Now, a lot of people will be like, well, we didn't consume a lot of carbs. The Inuit didn't consume a lot of carbohydrates. Well, actually, they consumed a lot more than we think. So there are something called glycoproteins, which is basically sugar bound to amino acids that are in the skins of animals, the skins of whales. It's called muktuk. And in fact, many Arctic explorers that lived with the Inuit said they cherished the muktuk more than the muscle meat and more than the fat. In fact, they said that a lot of the fat was actually used for lighting, for lamps, and for heating. Think about it. You're living in the Arctic. You have to burn a lot of that whale fat and seal fat to actually heat where you're living. You can't actually eat a lot of that fat. So actually, the Inuit diet was very high protein, moderately high actually in carbohydrate. If you actually add up all the glycoproteins in the gut epithelial that they cherished, the skins of all the animals that they consumed, particularly whale skin, the muktuk, and the glycoprotein in there. But also they consumed a lot of their food fresh, which would have given them glycogen, which is stored glucose, in skeletal muscle and in the liver. So they weren't eating no carb. Even the people that we try to hang our hat on is, man, the Inuit, they didn't have cardiovascular disease and all they ate was meat and the associated fat. But as I just said, they got a fair amount of carbohydrates by eating some of the food fresh, getting the fresh glycogen in skeletal muscle and in liver, and getting the glycoproteins in the skin and the gut epithelial, etc., okay, which contains carbohydrates. So they weren't consuming no carbs. There's advantages too to consuming some carbohydrates. Like basically glucose oxidation leads to 50% more CO2 production than fat oxidation. And a lot of people hear CO2 and they think CO2 instantly is bad. In order to oxygenate our muscles, CO2 is what allows the oxygen to be released from hemoglobin. So CO2 actually helps with oxygenating the skeletal muscle during exercise performance, let's say. We know eating more carbohydrates improves explosive exercise performance activity. We know that. So if you want to do explosive, any type of basketball, like sprinting, explosive types of movements, eating some carbs is going to help with that as well. So there are advantages to consuming carbohydrates from the fact of CO2 also is a vasodilator and an antioxidant. So more CO2 actually may be better. In fact, living at altitude is less oxygen, more CO2, and that may be partially some of the benefits why we see all these longevity cultures that live at altitude. But beyond just the CO2 and beyond the protein sparing effects of carbohydrates, and I talked about too how we feel. A lot of people feel better eating carbohydrates as well. We had said the decrease in the stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, by consuming some carbohydrates. And again, no human population ever ate no carbohydrates for the majority of their lifespan. They always consumed some carbohydrates, either in the form of glycoproteins or in the form of glycogen when they consumed the animal fresh. So once you are healthy and carb tolerant, probably around 120 grams of carbs, and of course this will ramp up as your activity level ramps up, is probably more the optimal range of intake. That's about what I consume, like on a normal day, probably around 120 grams of carbs. I mean, I don't measure these things precisely, but I have logged my food before throughout a full day, and it will range really anywhere from 120 typically grams of carbohydrates to upwards of 200 on really active days. If I do heavy lifting sessions and I do running and basketball, I might consume up to 200 grams of carbohydrates per day. But I do believe that consuming some carbohydrates is better than consuming no carbohydrates.